Welcome to another episode of Salesforce Trails and Trials, where we help you accelerate your career and turn soft skills into hard money by mining gold from project failures, bringing insights from ecosystem experts and inspiration from others on the trail. Now joining us with over 20 years in the ecosystem, please welcome our host, John Klein.
Welcome everyone to another episode of Salesforce Trails and Trials. Today we have Kay Stoner with us, and she's going to share a bit of her Trailblazer story. And Kay, welcome.
Hey, thank you. Thanks for having me.
My pleasure. Now, my first interaction with you was just thinking, I've been doing a lot of research, as many people are these days, with AI, and you had a very unique take on AI as it relates to personas and such. And we're going to get into that. But before we do that, I want to go all the way back because I love hearing how people first got into what like their kind of technical sense and self-understanding.
Yeah.
Many people believe that they're not technical people, but actually everybody possesses this in some way. And so I love hearing kind of what the genesis is. So maybe you can kind of go back to that first memory you have about, I might have a little skill or a little inclination towards this direction.
Well, if we're going to want to go way back to when I was just a little bit of a thing. When I was a kid, I had no interest in any sort of career. I'm like, why would anybody go to the office every day? My dad was a minister, and I saw how hard he worked, and he was working 6 days a week, and it seemed to me personally, as a 5-year-old, that his congregation was very ungrateful, and it was so much. I'm like, no, I want to be a writer, because it just fascinated me. Both of my parents were readers. And my whole family and everybody, reading was the thing. I mean, back in the day when books were still a thing. And so I wanted to be a writer, and I wanted to be the best writer ever. So I decided I was going to learn how to make character development. Like, what makes a realistic character? What would make them believable? And I read a lot, and I'm like, I don't believe that character. Why would they do that? That doesn't make any sense. And so I studied people, and I would take notes. I still have notebooks of like my notes about observing people. And over the years, going through school and everything, and writing was always kind of my refuge, because like so many of us in the tech sphere and beyond, I was awkward, so I found a lot of solace in my books, and the characters were in there. So by the time I get to like college age, I'm like, I still don't really understand people that well. I know I'm going to study cultural anthropology.
Wow.
Maybe that's something. And it actually did. So it was very helpful for context and understanding how being in different situations can cause people to do the same sorts of things in different ways. And it was just so interesting also to get the history, because anthropology, you have physical and you have cultural. Physical being the archaeology piece of it, and just to get that sense of history and how long we have been at this human thing, and even farther back now, because they keep finding older and older stuff. So people have been knocking around on planet Earth for an awful long time. But by the time I got to the end of my 4 years, I still kind of didn't exactly know what was going on. And anyway, what kind of future do you have in anthropology anyway, unless you're going to go on and do postdoc work? And then even then, even if I did get a job with National Geographic, I mean, my parents are like, how are you going to pay the bills? I'm like, I don't know. I'll be a writer. How are you going to pay the bills? So I really just wanted to have my bohemian lifestyle. I saw the rat race. I'm like, who wants that? Oh, please. So I'm like, okay, well, I'm gonna just find work that will pay the bills so I can work on my books. I can write my books and I can make art. I just wanted to do my bohemian thing. So I went down. One of my friends in high school, I hung out with people who were like years older than me when I was in high school. And there was this one guy who I knew who always had plenty of money. He was the biggest deadbeat on the planet. He would lie in bed and he just would just knock around and do nothing. But he always had money to work on his car. And he had fancy fog lights. He had all this stuff. So he always had money to work on his car. So I'm like, okay, well, if Mike can do it, I can too. So I went down to the temp agency and I said, hey, I'm looking for part-time work.
How old were you at this time?
I was like 20. I was out of school, so I was 20, 22,
Okay.
something like that.
Uh-huh.
22 years old. I'm like, I didn't have an accounting degree. I didn't have anything really useful. And I loved anthropology and I loved German. I also majored in German, but what are you going to do with that?
Hmm.
So, and they said, "Hey, do you know how to use a computer?" I'm like, "I can learn." And they said, "We will pay you $2 an hour more if you can use a word processor." I'm
Hmm.
like, "Sign me up." And
Right.
so they put me down in front of the terminal. WordStar. This was back in WordStar days. And so I learned WordStar and I loved it. It was fantastic. It was so much fun. And like I really took to it.
Hmm.
So I could make more money. And so I went around and I worked for some horrible people, but I was making enough money to get by. And I had a number of things. I had health issues and so forth that kept me from keeping full time work. But I always had this computer stuff. So, my meandering path took me here, there, and everywhere. And always knowing how to use a computer helped. It helped because this is back in like the late 80s, early 90s, and then even in the mid 90s before everybody had email and stuff. But my first job in high tech was actually out in Northern California. And I had gotten this, kind of temp to perm thing as kind of an office manager. And as it turned out, it was a little software company. And I'm a writer. And, I was working on my book and everything, but I'm like, they were looking for a technical writer. I'm like, I'm a writer. And they took a chance on me. And it turned out to be a really good fit. And so I did the technical documentation set for their software program. It was for DOS, it was for Windows 3.1, and then we did it for the Mac as well. So three different documentation sets, and I got to say, like I love the Apple approach because everything is you do it exactly the same every single time. You have the same style, the same approach. You don't have to figure it out. Where DOS and Windows is like, yeah, whatever you think is best.
Hmm.
So it was really good to have that rigor to do that. But I really took to it, and it's like, yeah, this is the thing. I can do this. So
Okay.
I worked for Intel. I worked on actually a hardware supplier to Intel, and this. And I heard some really great stories about the whole Intel AMD
Hmm.
drama that was going on at the
Okay.
time. But eventually, I accidentally ended up doing some freelance work for O'Reilly and Associates because they were in the town where I lived in Northern California. And I had no idea who they were. They seemed like nice people, but
Hmm.
that was my first exposure to the internet because they were working on Internet in a Box, where this was like in 1990, was it 94? Yeah, it was like 93, 94 ish. They were working on this Internet in a Box offering. And the stuff that I worked on was talking about TCP IP,
Hmm.
HTTP, these internet protocols, and then talking about how you run,
Yeah, these are like
connect.
technical training books.
Right, right.
Yeah.
Well, I wasn't doing technical training books. I was working on I was kind of compiling other things that
Hmm.
side research projects that they were doing, but exposed me to all of the stuff that they were doing. And I heard them talking about this. And then in the town library, they also had access to the Sonoma State Fat Pipe. And so they were all hooked up. And so you could sign up to sit at the terminal for an hour on
Hmm.
whenever you were there. I would be there all day, every Saturday. No one kicked me off. I'm like, I am learning. I was on all the Gopher servers in the world. I was like looking at the University of Minnesota, studying figuring out how to become an astronaut and definitively established that I will never be an astronaut, but it's fascinating to find out how it works. And just one thing led to another. And when the internet came along, started to pick up, I got into web development because as a writer, I was still like running into all
Hmm.
kinds of roadblocks and couldn't
Now I'm
see.
curious, before I
Yeah,
want to capture a couple of questions from,
yes.
did you find, because it seemed like when you first started out that
Mhm.
you were kind of like an artist in a sense,
Yeah,
right? Like,
I
and,
was.
and so I'm
Yeah.
curious, were you surprised that some of these inclinations you had, or maybe some of the things you were learning about, whether it's, the anthropology or some of
Yeah.
the other artistic elements, were you surprised that they had this really strong kind of application and connection towards maybe more technical or complex endeavors?
A lot of people wonder about how artists can be, technical as well. But you know what? It's a very creative thing. We are making things out of nothing. These documents never
Hmm.
existed before. This stuff never existed before. It's a tool. It's a way to make stuff. It's like very creative. And you're typing away, and it helps if you know how to type, but it's extremely creative.
Hmm.
And there's something also very satisfying about the process of making something and then not being criticized while you're making it. Because a computer is not going to call you an idiot. It's not going to say, that's a dumb idea. Why would you do that? It's not going to critique your work. It's just going to say yes or no.
Hmm.
No, that didn't work. Would you like to try again? So that was fantastic. I'm like, it's not going to yell at me if I
Yeah, so
experiment.
it's like a non-judgmental kind of
Right,
environment, right?
right,
Because
exactly.
artists, like the artists can be very, I like to think of myself as an artist because I won a finger painting contest in fourth grade. But
Yeah.
there's a vulnerability to it, right? Like you're creating things and you're putting out there and you're just leaving
Right.
it out there to be critiqued.
I know. People have looked at some of my artwork and they're like, "Oh, did your kid make that?" I'm like, "Oh, come on." Or they looked at it and said, "Wasn't that nice? Have you considered going to art school?" I'm
Yeah, or
like,
like, have you
"Come
considered
on."
throwing that away? How sad.
Yeah, like, and then meanwhile, like I'm looking at the other art that's out there, like, how is this worse than that? I mean, come
Hmm.
on,
Hmm.
people.
Yeah. Of course,
But
very selective.
yeah, yeah. And it's funny, who knows why people like what they like, but anyway, I like
Sure.
stuff better.
Quite subjective. So yeah, so now you've come to the point where you kind of discovered this kind of technical inclination. You're
Yeah.
being put into the stream
Yeah.
of some of these early because I remember the 90s as well, right? I mean,
Yeah.
Amazon I think comes out in 1992 or
Right.
3.
Right.
Commercial internet really starts to become
Yeah.
something that is catching on big
Yeah.
time during the mid
Oh
90s.
yeah. Yeah. I mean, like, I built my first website in 1995 because a friend of mine back in 92, before I moved out to California, she was an academic, and she was telling me about this thing called email and the web. I'm like, what? She's like, you would love it. I'm like, I don't know about that.
Right. They're like talking about it on, I remember they're talking about it on Good Morning America. And they're like,
Right?
yeah, if you go on your keyboard and on your to button, if you hold shift, there's that little at with a circle around it. Right. And
Right?
they're explaining the mechanics
Right. Right.
of an email address.
Right, right. I mean, I just remember I was running around telling everybody you have to get email. They're like, "What?" And now I'm like, I wish I'd never mentioned anything. Uh, but yeah, and it was just so wonderful because in 95 I had a horrible, horrible job. I mean, it was terrible. And I'm like, surely there must be a better way to live than this. So when I was riding to and from work, I was reading the bare bones guide to HTML.
Hmm.
I was committing everything to memory. I'd get home, I'd get on my computer and be working on this stuff, building websites and practicing. JavaScript came along, and then, oh my God, CSS came along. Like, oh, magic. But in 1996, during the Super Bowl, I saw a URL for the first time
Hmm.
in the advertisement, in one of the advertisements. I'm like, this is a thing. Because nobody's going to pay money to put their URL on the Super. It's a lot of money.
Hmm.
And I also knew that the real opportunity is not in building the websites, it's in maintaining them. Because, oh my heavens, it's a lot. And then things change, things break, something shifts, and you got to keep maintaining it. And so I was all in. And then after about a year later, I'm like, okay, well, I'm just going to put my resume out there and see what happens. And sure enough, I got picked up by somebody at a big financial services company that were paying consultants altogether too much to run their website, and they wanted to hire people, bring it in house. So
Hmm.
they brought me in house to do it. And it was great because the hilarious thing was that everybody in the design group and the web development group, there was me, like the writer and the artist. There was a playwright. There was a visual artist. There was a jewelry maker. I mean, we're all a bunch of artsy fartsy folks who got sick of, struggling to pay the bills. So we're getting into technology.
Wow.
Yeah.
What an amazing story. I remember back in, the mid 90s for me, it's probably more like 97, 98.
Yeah.
And these very large consulting organizations like
Right.
Razorfish,
Right.
IXL, like,
Yeah.
their whole job was they're on calls with customers and they're
Yeah.
like, can you move it to the right just 2 pixels?
Right.
Yeah. Perfect. Can you change that from that's the wrong there? It needs to be THERE. Oh, okay, sure.
Right.
And can you create a new page right there? And yeah, they're like
Yeah.
hand coding everything
Right.
because there
Right.
is no WordPress.
We all did hand coding. I mean, I actually was the person that did the evaluation for CMSs for this financial services
Mhm.
company because I was all in that space, and so I went through it. And I'm happy to say that the one that I picked became an industry leader. Hooray! But yeah, back in the day, and I was one of the first proponents for making templates out of these things.
Hmm.
We were all building these things by hand from scratch. And we were like literally taking the rulers that you used to get on your thing and making sure that they all lined up and doing side by side comparisons with screenshots. It's like, now it's very different.
Yes, it is very different. I mean, I remember back at the time, Vignette, I think, was the only
Yeah,
CMS that existed.
yeah,
That
yeah,
because I also my first startup
yeah,
was in 1998, which was a
yeah,
browser-based content management system
yeah,
called
yeah,
Site Director. And
yeah,
so yeah, I mean it's so I totally get the use case. So you're
yeah,
finding, right? You're kind of the creativity, building things,
right,
going into the writing, right? And then now your writing turns into kind of data, into like kind of metadata now because you're
mhm,
doing markup,
right,
with building websites and then looking
right,
to maintain those websites.
right, right. And also publishing my own stuff. It like I was over the moon when somebody from Norway emailed me and said, I read your thing and I really liked it. I'm like,
Wow.
and this is in 1997. I'm like,
Yeah, brings it makes the
somebody on
world
the other
smaller,
side of the
right?
world. Yeah, before everything was so connected. This is very exotic.
Hmm.
Somebody in Norway has read something. Like that's incredible.
Yeah, I remember when I had my Windows 3.11 because now I had
Yeah.
networking
Yes.
and I
Yeah.
had net meeting
Yeah.
running and
Yeah.
I don't know how I met the guy because back then you just have directories that you could
Yeah.
look people up
Right. Right.
and I was doing screen sharing with a guy in Canada and I was like,
Yeah.
wow, this is I mean certainly I had a book on my lap because
Right.
anything I wanted to do I needed to wait a little bit so I would just
Right.
go ahead and read my
Right.
book while I'm waiting
Right.
for my computer to catch up.
Yeah.
But it was a fascinating experience to think
Yeah.
about that kind of engagement
Right.
far
Right.
outside of my current domain, you know.
Right. Right. After just, and what a difference from what, because when I was growing up, I mean, when we were growing up, when we were young, before the internet, if you moved away and before everything was so connected, if you moved away or if your friends moved away or
Yeah,
anything,
out of
you
sight,
never
out of
see
mind.
it was as though they died.
Hmm.
So, and I, and I moved around a fair amount. So like, and when I was going to school, like grade school early, every year there would be a different class of kids. And so all the kids that I had gotten to know the year before were gone. It's like they never even existed. It's like they all died. I'm like, and nobody kept in touch. You said, oh yeah, all right. Nobody wrote.
Mm.
And now the idea that that you can reach out, I'm back in touch with people that I hadn't spoken to for like 30, 40 years. Oh my heavens. But now we're back in touch and we're best buds again. It's wild. It's hilarious.
Yeah, that's amazing. And certainly it's true because if it's true for our friends,
Mm,
that capacity is also true when we think about, what organizations are able to do today
mm,
by not just serving their local constituents, right? Their local
mm,
customers who are here
right,
and then
right,
they're gone, but now I can have a much, much larger space and stay in touch with people
right,
really no matter where they travel,
right,
which is
right.
really incredible and but also adds a lot of complexity, right? It adds a
Yeah.
challenge because now I got language barriers, I got time zones, I have
Yeah.
expectations
Yeah.
around when I need to be available.
Yeah. Yes. It's a lot
So
of work.
very interesting. So I saw that you started to, just thinking about your background, you started
Yeah.
going a little bit heavy, like really heavy into data and
Yeah.
starting to,
Yeah.
it seems like some data analysis and maybe you can share
Hmm.
a little bit about that and kind of some
Yeah.
learnings you built out of that.
Sure. Sure. Yeah. So, back in 2000, I was with a team that, and this was part of the financial services company. There was an arm of the company that did venture funding, and and people would go in, they do their pitch, and then they say, "Oh, this looks great." They'd write them a check for $1 million, And then they would come to us and say, okay, how can we use this? Because we just gave these people $1 million. We're like, okay, let's see. So our boss, she would prepare the PowerPoints and go out into the business units and do her little dog and pony show, and then come back and say, okay, they bought it. Let's go make this. And some of the stuff that we're working with was natural language processing, machine learning, taxonomies, ontologies, and a whole lot of data cleanup. So
let's break down. I want to break down some of those terms real quick, right?
Sure.
So maybe just in your own words, kind of walk through those 4 elements and kind of what did they represent? What part of the chain did they represent as it related to the data?
It was, so the natural language processing was just what we could do with the data. And the data cleanup was and the machine learning. So they gave us this very, very simple interface that had a whole bunch of places to put data in. And then they said, okay, you put your stuff in here and then run it. We're like, okay, great. And nothing happened. And we called them and said, what's going on? They go, well, how did you train it? What do you mean train it? Oh, we have to train it. We're like, what do you? So they gave us a little crash course. They flew in from whatever country they were from, and they walked us through and said, oh, we have to do this and this and this and these rules, and then you have to decide how you want this thing to behave. And then once it knows, then it can do it. But until it knows, you can't really get anything out of it. So the data was, that was back before there was, everything was in these relational databases and everything was very structured, which in some ways is easier than it is now. But at the same time, we had to match up all these different structures. And then also when we were getting data from different sources, the formatting would be different, the display would be different. We're trying to aggregate things and display them in the common space, and we have to work through all of that. So just understanding what the end product was supposed to look like, we had to start at the end.
And that's kind of the taxonomy element, right? Is organizing how each of those,
and then the taxonomy is kind of in between. Like, how do we get from here? We have all this stuff over here, and we have to get it to be nice and tidy and neat here. How do we organize it? How do we make some sense out of it and organize things and get them to associate with each other? And then, oh, by the way, where does this fit in the grand scheme of things with relation to other data sources that we have? So taxonomies and ontologies were very much involved with each other at that time too. I think eventually we may have been able to implement it for somebody, but it was limited. And this was not AI level stuff because we didn't have deep learning at the time. So there was only so much that we could do. But still, those principles, the same problems that we were dealing with 25 years ago, still today, they're still happening and people are still kind of hashing through them. So in a way.
Were there any kind of surprising insights or, interesting points of learning you found by trying to bring this data together to accomplish some tasks?
Just that the tiniest little thing matters. I mean, a freaking comma, really, and just having the consistency and making sure that capitalization is the same. And then if you're looking at 2 words side by side, 2 concepts side by side, they better be, it's like they have to be able to communicate with each other. They have to be of like kind. So those were some of the things, and people are going to have everybody has their challenges, different kinds of challenges. But one of the things that we found was because we did have these strong structures to the different data sources that we're working with, just trying to get them to match up and getting them normalized was a lot of work. But once we got it figured out, like the euphoria, when we finally got something cleaned and cleaned up and nice and hygienic and just it was just beautiful that we fed it in and then it did what we wanted it to do. It's like, this is incredible. Like, oh, magic. Yeah. But like the amount of time that it took to render and do the final thing was minuscule compared to how much time we spent just getting the data ready to go. And it wasn't even really bad, awful data from it. Like, it was in good shape in the sources that it came from, but we had to true it up and normalize it and make sure everything was of like kind. So, yeah.
Wow. Yeah, and that's certainly a dilemma that many people are dealing with today, data from different
Hmm.
places. And so there's some tooling, of course, today that's available
Yeah.
that wasn't available back then.
Yeah.
And but I think the dilemmas are very similar in
Yeah.
that you still have data has different elements, and the meaning of those elements is often varies a little bit, even
Right.
when they're described the same way.
Right.
Uh,
Right.
so
Right.
very interesting. So let's move forward and just talk through about, so now you kind of have this foundation from
Hmm.
the anthropology side.
Right.
Did you essentially stop that line of, did you finish anything with that? Is that your degree, or I'm just
No,
curious?
that just I just I remember like one day I was walking across the quad in school and I'm like, I don't want to be somebody who studies culture. I want to be the person that makes it. I
Hmm.
want to make stuff. I want to create the world. I don't want to be following after like dusting off little
Mhm.
skeletons and trying to figure out what some person in like a jungle somewhere is saying to me. And anyway, I don't want to intrude in their lives anyway, because a lot of it felt really intrusive to me. So I'm like, I'm gonna go and do my writer. I'm gonna be a bohemian. I'm gonna forget this whole career thing. I'm just gonna do my own thing. But I mean, fast forward, like for some reason, a whole lot of my actual career, and I did do have one, has been around search, or fundamentally connecting people with the information that they need to
Hmm.
do what they want to do, or be what they want to be, or just
Yeah, just
or to
minimizing foraging,
right,
get
right.
there.
Right, exactly. So I went through like there's a lot of search in building search engines, integrating search, cleaning up data for search, working with search vendors, all of that. And over the years, I've run search programs and search portfolios and programs and projects and all of that for some pretty big organizations. And one of the search vendors that I was working with, um, they had a really good product and they were very well connected, so they got unicorn status and it's a big deal. All of a sudden they started calling themselves AI, and I'm like, that doesn't seem right to me, because I'd seen their code base. I'm like, I don't know if I would call that, I mean, artificial, maybe intelligence, I don't know. um but there was a lot of hype, just huge amount of hype. And this was back in, this had to be like maybe 5 years ago.
Hmm.
But they were getting in, like, as everything AI was starting to pick up. And I'm like, because also working with this group that did the third party software integrations for the venture folks. We I developed a pretty good sniff test for if something was viable or not, because I sat through so many demos of people coming in and pitching stuff. And it just didn't seem like AI was really there. And there were people that were excited about it. And then ChatGPT comes out, and then Crayon, and like there's a whole bunch of stuff coming out onto the market. And I was very skeptical, because there was a lot of smoke and mirrors, and a lot of the stuff that they were doing, it had been possible to do that stuff for years already, if you had the proper data, if you had the proper infrastructure, and if you knew how to connect the dots. There was nothing AI about it whatsoever. But they were like, here, let's package it. They're packaging and selling it that. So I'm like, I'm going to wait. I'm going to give it time. And then about a year and a half ago, I'm sitting on a conference call with some business associates, and somebody was demoing a whole bunch of AI tools. And people were like, and maybe two-thirds of them were kind of shiny object, like fancy search, or
Hmm.
something that wrapped up, they had the AI label on it, but I didn't buy it. But about a third of it actually was. And I'm like, to my mind, the stuff was like 65% there. And that's kind of my baseline. If something's at 65%, it's getting momentum, and then it's time to start paying attention. So I'm like, I'm going to pay attention to this. And also because the AI world is so, like, training really shapes so much. So the more we engage with it, the more training it gets. And if you don't like the direction that something is going, just get in there and mess around with it and add more data to its training set. Get in there, interact with it, give it more to think about, give it more to integrate into its overall intelligence. So I'm like, I don't like a lot of the stuff that's going on here, so therefore I'm getting involved.
Yeah,
What?
it's like people choose different tools and applications based on their ability to customize. So people choose
Right,
Salesforce, for example, because there's a
right,
whole second product behind
right,
it that
yeah,
is the configuration and setup area,
right,
and that's why they buy it. And so it's
right,
an interesting, kind of meta thought, if you will, to think
yeah,
about that. There's a AI is doing something, and sometimes maybe it doesn't
mm,
do it well,
right,
and so you can go and customize the way
right,
it goes about doing it so that
right.
it does it better.
Exactly, exactly. And I think that's kind of where we are now. And there are people are making much of us kind of getting up to like a threshold for what all can be done. Can it get any faster? Can it get any more powerful? Can it do any more? Um, what we have now, it seems to me, is like an excellent raw material. And what I like to do is what I consider like aftermarket customizations of AI.
Hmm.
You get in there, you take what they have, which is
Mhm.
perfectly fine. It's like you
Mhm.
drive a Camry off a lot. You just bought a Camry, you drive it off a lot. It's a perfectly good car. It's nice and everything. It's so good. It's most commonly stolen because the parts can be swapped out.
Sure.
But anyway, so you drive the Camry off the lot. But when you get it home, or you take it to your brother-in-law who's a mechanic, and he swaps out the wheels, he puts new rims on it, he puts a spoiler on it, he tricks out the inside, he puts a new stereo system in it,
Mhm.
and he jacks it up, he gives a new suspension, and while he's at it, he adds another gear to the transmission. So this is kind of what I do with AI.
Hmm.
With the personas that I work with,
Yeah, you
because
kind of take a car and turn it into a race car, in a sense,
right, right,
right?
right, or like a camper van, take
Mhm.
your Sprinter
Okay.
van and
Okay.
trim it
Yeah, and
out.
both options are available, right? Yeah.
Right, exactly, exactly, yeah.
Wow. And so I'm curious as we dig into the details of this, and it's been
Mm,
fascinating to hear just, kind of your story and how you got here, because I,
mm,
I definitely think there's some really neat, unexpected turns.
yeah.
And so maybe just highlight a little bit of some of the problems that we're trying to solve here, right? When
Mm,
you think about aftermarket AI as you describe
mm,
it,
right.
what are some things that AI doesn't do well?
Mm,
And that, much like the standard car, right? The standard car is not going to win any races.
right,
So what
right,
are some things that, AI, standard AI didn't do well, like consumer
right,
AI, and then
right,
the way that you're able to kind of think about the aftermarket and do enhanced things?
right, yeah. Well, I mean, it doesn't do very well at reading our minds. Not that it should,
Hmm.
but I think that there's so much hyper. Oh, it can do it. It's so powerful. I flatly refuse to learn all of the alphabet soup prompting techniques. I mean, I just can't. Like all the different acronyms for craft and this, that, and the other thing. There are all these different like special things that you can do to set the prompt up to get the right information out of it.
Hmm.
um, I discovered that as granular as I could get with the prompts that I was building, and I had some pretty extensive ones,
Hmm.
what what actually worked better for me was using natural language and just talking to it. Because within that language, you're able to provide to the model a lot of the same stuff that you do with like a technically formatted prompt. And there are cases where a technically formatted prompt is very useful. But for what I wanted to do, to interact with it, to get information out, to just to see what else was there, to get into the model and pull out the goodness that was in there, I found that language actually gave it every bit as much context and direction as an abstract prompt. So there's that. And then also what I discovered is that when I when I create a persona, or I create like a personality, and I tell the model to act as that, with these characteristics, with this personality type. Here are your character strengths and your character weaknesses. Here are your skills. Here's what you're really good at, and here's what you're terrible at. Here's your personality type, Myers-Briggs. Where are you in the disc profile, and what's your communication style? All of that. When I build out this very detailed persona profile, that's like a persona overlay that's like a super prompt that when I interact with the model, then using that persona overlay, it really focuses the way that it responds to me. And I can also narrow, it's like a filter for what I want to look for.
Hmm.
So if I'm researching birds of the Amazon, I come up with one that's like you're a longtime bird watcher who's traveled the world, and you lived in South America for a number of years, watching birds and cataloging them and doing all these things. Like, give it that specific expertise so it knows where to look for that kind of stuff. And then I don't have to keep reminding it of what it's supposed to do. It knows that it's supposed to look at the data and look at the world through that lens.
Hmm. Now, prior to this, just with some preparation, right, you helped me set up a 5-person team who I
Mm-hmm.
named after the movie Top Gun, right? So
Yep.
I called them
Yep.
my kind of Top Gun team.
Yeah.
And they had different points of emphasis. Some were big picture thinkers, some were
Mm-hmm.
more detail oriented, kind of project manager types, or
Yeah.
and I think what one thing I discovered or kind of realized in the process is that sometimes we think of data and information as though it's in a vacuum, as
Mm-hmm.
though it's like I can give the same piece of accurate factual data to a variety of different people and it'll be understood
Right.
accurately, consistently across that group of people, which is
Right.
actually not true.
Right.
Right. I'm very relational. I think in general, like
Mm-hmm.
we might imagine in this
Mm-hmm.
kind of what like didactically or whatever, the information's out there and I can just
Yeah.
gather it. But really we learn relationally. We
Right.
learn by extending some trust and
Right.
really interpreting what we hear. So the more we can cater or tailor that message that we're going to hear to the way that we actually process and think, right? Like I'm a
Yeah.
top-down thinker.
Yeah.
I like starting with the big picture
Yeah.
elements and then making
Yeah.
my way down, where other people, like my wife, is a bottom-up person. She
Yeah. Yeah.
talk first about the practical and the boundaries, and then we'll
Right.
put in whatever we can within those
Mm-hmm.
limited spaces.
Right.
And I found that was interesting because your persona examples for me
Yeah.
it included some of those dimensions where my AI team is actually going to speak to me in a way that I prefer rather than expecting me to didactically just interpret what the accurate information is that they state, sometimes inaccurately, but either way, whatever it might be, they're not going to say it the way they say it and expect me to adjust.
Right. Right. Yeah, it's so true. It is a very relational thing. And when we get more than one persona in on the action, it really gets interesting. I came across a paper not too long ago. It's called Unleashing the Emergent Cognitive Synergy in Large Language Models, a task-solving agent through multi-persona self-collaboration, which is
Hmm.
talking about exactly this, that it unleashes the emergent cognitive synergy. You get more stuff. And when a persona is interacting with you and you're interacting with it, because these personas are constructed in ways that we understand as social relational beings,
Mm-hmm.
they're like it's a new kind of user interface. This is an n-dimensional user interface that to access behaviorally the kinds of data and information we need from the model. And then we
It's,
can
it's
work
like
with it.
multi-threaded. I mean, if we think about back in the computing world, right? It's like
Right,
having a multi-threaded process. But in this
right,
scenario, in that scenario, the threads don't always interact with each other. In
right,
this case, the threads are tailored and kind of curated to my personality type, and they're
right,
also interacting with each other behind the
right.
scenes. Is that right?
Right. Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. You can make them and you can change them in flight too. If you're like, yeah, I don't like your tone.
Hmm.
Or if you like, you guys need to argue a little bit more because you're not coming up with some very interesting ideas.
Hmm.
Or you can change them in flight. But yeah, absolutely. It's much more nuanced. It's much more textured, and you can actually get more context. And I found that my thinking process has changed in as a result of working with these personas. I am much less quick to jump to conclusions than I used to be.
Hmm.
I'm in the habit of asking them, what am I missing? And also not being yelled at
Hmm.
because I've missed something. They're like, oh, and then they go back and they come up with something else, or like, sorry, I missed that, or can you slow down and like break that into smaller pieces? It's making me less reactive because I'm more accustomed to working with like
Hmm.
cognitive partners who number one get me, and number two will work with me in whatever scenario we're in.
Hmm. Yeah, so I'd love to. This is a fascinating element, and I really like that dimension of different elements or different learning areas I'm more or less familiar with already. So I might be able to take it in bigger chunks if I already have prior context, prior experience, but other elements that I don't have that, I'm going to ask maybe to break it down, or can you
Yeah,
use an analogy that I am familiar with? And
right.
they're able to respond. And I think what's interesting here too, like in my case, I took what you provided and I
Mhm.
put it into the assistant API
Yeah,
in OpenAI, and
yeah,
so I
yeah, yeah,
have this kind of dedicated
yeah.
thread where I can always return to, which I can
Yeah,
also access that via the API. So I can
right,
have that team, my Top Gun team, now connected via my Slack channel. So when
right.
I go to that particular Slack channel, my five, team members are always there waiting and listening for
That's
me.
amazing. That's amazing. Yeah, I need to do that. Yeah, I just recently got pulled into Slack from a couple of different groups I'm working with. I've been off Slack for years.
Yeah, I know it's
Now,
amazing, and
yeah,
it's so simple, and you have access to a tremendous amount of the thread history and lots of elements that you can do. You have access to all of the users. There's so much
amazing.
interactivity you can have there that really makes it accessible. And so I'm curious. I want to give the listeners who might not have experienced anything like this, right? This might
Mhm.
seem like a very esoteric topic to them, but
Yeah,
I think it's going to be more the norm, because who
yeah.
wants to interface with generic,
It's
right?
so
When,
boring.
when you go to
Oh, yeah,
ChatGPT, right, like you're interfacing with consumer AI, which is generic.
yeah,
It's going to do its best,
right,
but providing it background as far as, what I would call kind of people first dimensions, right? So
right,
providing it like, hey, what context are you reasoning in? And I think
right.
you shared an example, and I'm curious if you can highlight some distinctions here, but you mentioned that by providing the same question to an AI, like a persona that had maybe a locality or a language background
Right.
versus another, that you
Right.
actually found different conclusions or more clarity.
This was really fascinating. And I'll preface this by saying that the math that the models produced is the math is wrong, but relatively speaking, because they always underestimate the number of tokens and the number of time that it takes to do things. I have another system that actually counts the tokens that are taken and is probably about maybe 30 times more, 30 to 150 times more tokens that are actually used than it was reporting. However, relatively speaking, there was a difference from one language to the next. So what I did was I had a very complex decision scenario. I used to be on my town's zoning board of appeals, and we would have a lot of things come across our plates that involved balancing local zoning needs
Hmm.
with developer demands, with state regulations, with what the neighbors were saying. There was a lot, and there was a lot at stake in making the right decision. And it was just really hard, but we had to do it over and over. So I created that same scenario, and then I would tell the model, and I used ChatGPT for this, and I told the model, okay, here's a dilemma that I need you to solve. I want you to reason through it and solve the issue in a certain language. But I want you to count the number of tokens that it takes, count the amount of time that it takes, and then also talk about the relative complexity of the question and also the answers, and then tell me how many turns you took to figure this out,
Hmm.
and then give me the final results in English. And I used Hindi, I used Latin American Spanish, Portuguese, Chinese simplified, Japanese, and also AI native symbolic language.
Hmm.
Because a lot of people in a group that I'm in, they were talking about using AI native symbolic language. I'm like, I'll try that.
Hmm.
And then also I said, okay, the model can feel free to change languages in midstream. If you feel like you can reason better in another language, you can change that. And it's interesting because initially it just chose to switch to Spanish, Latin American Spanish, but then later it chose to switch to Eurocentric languates. And then I'm like, why Eurocentric? Why didn't you do like Hebrew or Arabic or
Hmm.
Asian languages? And the next time it went through, I said, just cycle through different Asian languages. There were significant differences in the amount of time that it said it
Mm.
took, plus the number of tokens that it took. There were also significant differences in the reasoning, because I would have it print out its reasoning and why it made the decisions that it made. And it was all very culturally, like it was culturally specific. In the Latin American Spanish, it sounded like a lot of the Latin American friends that I've had, they're very concerned with like how it affected the community. It was
Mm.
very communally oriented and it was very communal. And for the Chinese simplified, I think was much more kind of factual and like these are the facts. This is what we have to do. Find a compromise, but make sure you're following the rules. And then Portuguese was very long. Japanese took fewer tokens because I mean the Japanese language has fewer letters, one
Mm.
letter per word in some cases. But the time that it took so much longer to figure it out. And when I looked at the reasoning behind it, it said, well, they have to factor in all these potential disasters that can happen. And there's a lot at stake. And we have to think about the community, and we have to think about the environment. We have to think about all these things. The amount of time that it said for the AI native symbolic language, it was so fast that it didn't even show up on the graph.
Wow.
Were like 300 milliseconds, which is pretty fast. An AI native symbolic language is 0.058 milliseconds.
Mm.
Like, phew. And when it did this, I'm like, what? It's like done? And it was done. And it used about the same number of tokens as other, but Hindi actually came in faster time and fewer tokens. And the Indians that I talked to, they're like, we told you, we already know this. I'm like,
That's fun. Did you find that the conclusion was really helpful?
I found it very interesting, to see why it would decide what it decided. Some of them, like the German, I think I did one in German, and that it was a separate test, but it like flat out just refused. It's like, no, we're not going to build this because it makes no sense that you would jeopardize the water source and the well-being of the community just because a bunch of developers want to come in and make some money.
Interesting.
And then we're more balanced. So like we need to carefully weigh. Yes, you should approve with conditions, or consider not. But some were flat out rejected. They're like, no, this is a terrible idea. Don't do it.
Interesting. So just thinking about like others who, right, like that's a very interesting use case, right? The complexities and the competing priorities of kind of a zoning and variance appeals process.
Right.
I'm curious, maybe you can highlight some examples that, right, like you've seen or you've helped others kind of set up where these AI teams can really support. And while you're thinking about that, I'll just share my example of what I used it for. So essentially, after setting up this team, and I went through and I planned out, I encouraged it and asked that it would help me to evaluate what the benefit of partnering with a radio station on a radio show. This is an AM radio station.
Yeah.
So, I'm an avid listener myself, but I don't know, what type of people and my peers and such. So I found it very interesting to it brought in a lot of interesting insights and, thinking about reach and about activities to do during the show, ways to engage people, ways to kind of keep continuity from show to show.
Yeah.
Ways to repurpose the show contents, and so it was helpful for me, and I have some good ideas, and I've sort of accepted the opportunity to do the radio show. So we'll hear more about it. It's going to come out. It's starting in April.
That's
but
great.
But it was just an interesting, and I think what was fascinating to me about it was I've been working as an independent, professional, probably for over 25 years. I love owning the value chain and creating, much like you talked about, right? That I like the opportunity to to kind of look at the world through, some people see problems, they see roadblocks. I see, right, potential and opportunities and ways to serve people. And I love that. And I love the freedom to exercise that. So it's funny to be, whether it's in the shower or driving to go get my kids at school or whatever it might be, and thinking about, I should talk to my team about that.
Right.
Right. Because I have a human team as well.
Right.
They often are focused on their head down in kind of where they are
Right.
they're kind of working already and
Right.
diving in. And so I don't have a lot of peers that I necessarily kind of dream with like
Right.
this.
Yeah.
And so I found that was a surprising benefit here
Yeah.
is it gave me a venue to
Right.
be able to dream a bit. And because it keeps track of history in my
Yeah.
assistant, I
Mm-hmm.
could go back and refer. And as I went along, I said, hey, that's great. Add that to the future document. And so
Yeah.
it's basically compiling over time
Yeah.
this
Yeah. Yeah.
document that at some future point I can ask it to output and it's going to
Right.
get, which is very interesting.
Yeah. It's just, yeah, it's fascinating that having a thinking partner, an objective thinking partner who gets you, and you can clarify if like, because sometimes my teams get it completely wrong. I'm like, no, you missed the boat on that, like let's look at it this way. But that exact kind of thing, like if you're in a situation where you could really use some additional input, or you need a different angle to think about things from, or you just need something to get you out of your head or have your thoughts mirrored back to you. Um, I use writing teams a lot, not to write for me, but to help me brainstorm and help me think.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of times I will literally walk around in my living room dictating and just have this back and forth, just clarifying the ideas. It's like I have lots of ideas.
Mm-hmm.
Not all of them are good. So it helps me to clarify like what I'm really thinking, because sometimes I'm all over the map, and they can pull out like some salient points and say, this is what I hear you saying. Other things like for planning, prioritizing, because I got a lot going on, and just prioritizing things and saying what really matters right now
Mm-hmm.
and what is going to matter if you don't do it, which is
Mm-hmm.
sometimes a bigger consideration. But
Yeah, well,
that,
I think coming back to just I like talking about these examples because I think the listener is going to consider some of these elements, and that's what will motivate them to kind of
Mhm.
take a next step and try and figure out right how
Mhm.
they can test this out.
Yeah,
So and I haven't tried it with my team yet, but I use another tool called it's called Klein. It actually is
yes,
spelled like my last name, right?
yeah, yeah,
It's a great tool. It operates inside VS Code.
yeah, nicely done. I love what you've done with
Yeah,
it.
great. My pleasure. And I love that telling people about that, plus about Klein Cellars, the winery up in Sonoma County.
Yeah,
I love
yeah.
giving Klein wine, and people are like, "Oh, wow, thank you." I'm like, "Oh, it's no
Mm,
problem. My pleasure."
yeah,
So Fred, if you're listening, thank you for giving me that honor. What I love about it is also when we think about architecture and thinking about kind of gap analysis
yeah,
and thinking about like what am I missing as it
right,
relates to, this particular topic, or if I want to serve this particular user in this
yeah,
circumstance,
right,
what are the, what's a good checklist that I should
yeah,
be walking through? I've
exactly,
found that to be really helpful because it has kind of the plan versus um, do mode, if you will.
right.
And I haven't used my team, but I think it would also be good for something like that.
Oh yeah, that's my favorite question. What am I missing? And sometimes I'll, because they tend to be very complimentary. Oh, that's a great idea. They think all my ideas are great. I'm like, you all need to just tone it down a little bit. And sometimes I'll say, okay, now I know we've talked a lot about this and we've covered a lot of ground, and I'm really grateful for this because it's like that reinforcement,
Hmm.
telling it what it's doing right, then that knows to give you more. But then saying something like, I have been wrong about many things in my life, and I missed a lot of opportunities, or bad things happened because I got it wrong or I missed something. I'm more interested in finding out more details than I am in being right. And I want to make sure that I have the most ideas
Hmm.
possible to work with. So can you help me really think this through from a whole bunch of different viewpoints? Because I want to enlarge my thinking and I want to do the best job possible. And then it's like, okay. And then I get really great stuff.
Wow. That's fascinating. So for someone who's listening to this and this is like it's kind of like mind blown, right? They haven't even
Mhm.
thought about having one or multiple personas that essentially are on their it's funny. It's like we all remember the A team. So
Yeah,
now it's like the AI team
right, right.
that can give you, basically I like to think about the idea like I'm sitting in my chair and AI is not replacing me in my chair. It's putting a cape on me, right in my chair as I sit here. And so what are some recommendations you'd say of, three things people should do to kind of, consider moving towards this and kind of learning to see how this can really help them?
Think about everything that's in the models that we don't know about. Think about all the information that's in there. Not only does it have, well, okay, so not all the things, because a lot of it was like 18 to 24-year-old single white guys living in their parents' basement playing Call of Duty all day. But there's a lot, I mean, there's a ton of really amazing information in there that we're not even fully aware of the complete scope. What could you do if you knew more? What could you do if you had access to that? And on top of that, not only does it have all this information, but it also has the patterns, and it has seen the best and the worst of us, and it has seen what works and what fails, and it can help us access the lessons from that we don't seem to learn very well. So what could you do if you knew? What could you do if you knew more? What could you do if you had a different perspective? What could you do if you weren't stuck on that idea? Or if you had this thing going over and over in your head and you're just stuck on this thing? How would your life be different if you weren't stuck anymore?
Mm-hmm.
Or you could put it in some larger context.
Yeah, or in my case, right, I'm less skilled at taking kind of grand ideas and turning them into kind of executable,
Right.
prioritized
Right.
elements. And so I
Right.
did find it was helpful to,
Yes.
even if it's just a draft, even if it's something that I take and I can now bring back
Right.
to my human team and be like, well, here's
Right.
an idea.
Right.
That's actually still of tremendous value, and it
Yes.
gets everyone through that kind of blank canvas blocker
Right.
that all of us are. If I'm like, okay, I want to do something about this, and I open up a blank Google Doc and now I'm stuck,
Right. Right.
right?
Yeah, I mean, there's no need to be stuck anymore. Like if any, and so even if you're stuck, the process doesn't need to be stuck. You don't have to be the gating factor. You can say, "Team, I'm out of ideas. I do this all the
Mhm.
time. I'm out of ideas. Help me come up with something." And then if they come up with something I hate, then that helps even more because this
Mhm.
is a terrible idea. And they're like, "Sorry," and then we move on. But yeah, like that, like what could you do if you weren't limited by the things that you can't do?
It's a good point, and I think you provide on your website a place where people can sample this, where they can go to, they can try consumer AI and do something, and then they can essentially try something very similar, using kind of a sample that they can set up, and then kind of compare the difference.
Yeah, I have it. So I have it behind what I consider a fairly modest paywall.
Sure.
But I don't do the whole monthly subscription thing. But if you want to experiment with it, it's $29 for a year access. You can make as many personas as you like with that. And then for the teams, it's $49 a year for a team of 1 to 5. And if you want to
Okay.
get bigger than that, go with the pro team, it's 149. You can make as many teams as you like with this once you have access. So I think compared to some of the subscriptions, I mean, I had to drop a bunch of them because it was getting to be too much. So I'm really sensitive to that.
Sure.
But at the same time, this can be very powerful stuff.
Mm.
And I've gotten some really great feedback from people who just had no idea that this was possible. And yeah,
Yeah, well, I certainly didn't even really consider, I considered, from a prompt engineering standpoint, right? Like
right,
baselining and
right,
and adding RAG data and things that
right,
can give context. But the
right,
idea of having a persistent
right,
persona over time,
right,
was not something that I'd really thought of. And
right.
so yeah, certainly we'll add your website in the show notes, and it's really been a pleasure kind of getting to know your
Yeah.
Trailblazer story today. And what's great about this is that these, once you embed these into an AI tool of your choice, they can be
Mhm.
accessed via API. So there's elements that, whether I'm using Slack or Salesforce or other elements, there's the ability to engage tasks, messaging, all sorts of aspects get
Mhm.
with these personas, which is a fascinating world to engage in.
And it makes agents even more agentic because with that back and forth, and then with them working with the information in whole new ways, you can unlock even more behaviors in your agents if you incorporate these in there. I have a couple of agents I've been experimenting with. Very simple things for pulling out summaries of information from news articles, but the tone is different, and the kind of information they pull out is different. So you can just play with it. I say just play with it, experiment with it, see where it takes you, and just keep going.
Yeah, no, it's good, and I love it because it's a continual. It's another example of that kind of people first dimension,
Right.
even within our agents, right?
Right.
They
Right.
need to serve the human in a better
Yeah.
capacity
Yeah.
and communicate more clearly.
Yeah. Wonderful.
Awesome.
Okay.
Well done.
Great. Thank you, John.
Thanks for joining us on another episode of Salesforce Trails and Trials. If you found this episode valuable, we would love your help reaching others. Please subscribe, leave us a 5-star review, and share this with another who would benefit.